Most people think of the Second World War as a fight in the fields of France or the snows of Russia. They picture Normandy's beaches or the rubble of Berlin. But what if the war's true turning point happened somewhere else entirely? Well, what if it was decided in a vast, empty desert of sand and rock under a blazing sun? The North African campaign was more than just a sideshow. It was a 3-year struggle from 1940 to 1943 that stretched across thousands of miles of Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. It involved millions of soldiers from Britain, America, Germany, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and France. Over 620,000 men became casualties. It was a war of extremes, of blinding heat and freezing nights, of incredible distances and a desperate scarcity of water, food, and fuel. Why did they fight so hard for this place? Was it just about a strip of coastline and a few dusty ports? Or was something much bigger at stake? Could a victory here really change the fate of the entire world? The answers are not what you might expect. The fight in the desert was a brutal school, a laboratory for war, and a political chessboard all at once. It shaped the armies, the generals, and the alliances that would go on to liberate Europe. It was where a green American army learned how to fight. It was where legends were made and broken, and it was where the first major land victory against the German war machine was won, sending a shockwave of hope across the globe. Forgetting North Africa is like reading a book and skipping the chapter that explains the entire plot. Number 16, who were the French fighting for? The situation in France was complicated. After the country was overrun in 1940, a new government was set up in the town of Vichy. This government controlled the southern part of France and its vast overseas empire, including the colonies in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Officially, this Vichy government was neutral. In reality, it often worked with the German authorities. This created a deep and painful division among the French people. On one side were the Vichy forces. They had a large army and navy in North Africa. Their leaders, like Admiral Francois Darlan, believed that collaborating was the only way to save what was left of France. They were proud men, and they bitterly remembered a British naval attack on their fleet at Mers el-Kebir in 1940. They saw the British as former allies who had abandoned them and then attacked them. They were not eager to help the British or the Americans. On the other side were the Free French, led by General Charles de Gaulle from London. De Gaulle believed the fight was not over. He called on all French soldiers and citizens in the empire to join him and continue the war. But in 1942, his forces were still small. He was seen by many, including some of his own allies like the American president, as a difficult and unproven leader. When the Americans and British launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, they landed in territory controlled by Vichy France. They hoped the French would welcome them as liberators. They were wrong. The Vichy French forces resisted and resisted fiercely. At Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, there was heavy fighting. French soldiers fired on American soldiers. Hundreds were killed on both sides in a tragic, confusing conflict that lasted for 3 days. This initial resistance showed just how deep the divisions ran. The American planners, especially diplomat Robert Murphy, had tried to make a deal with a French general named Henri Giraud, hoping he could command the loyalty of the Vichy troops. But Giraud had little influence. The real power was Admiral Darlan, who happened to be in Algiers visiting his sick son. The Americans were forced to make a controversial deal. They recognized Darlan as the leader of the French in North Africa in exchange for a ceasefire. This Darlan deal caused a political firestorm. The Allies were now working with a man who had been a key figure in a collaborationist government. De Gaulle and the Free French were furious. They felt betrayed. Winston Churchill had to defend the decision in the British Parliament, calling it a temporary measure of military expediency. The book A Savage War of Peace by Alistair Horn details the intense political maneuvering and the sheer messiness of the situation. The campaign wasn't just about fighting the Germans and Italians, it was also about navigating a French civil war. After Darlan was assassinated in December 1942, the situation remained tense. Slowly, over many months, the Free French forces under de Gaulle gained ascendancy. The French troops in North Africa, once loyal to Vichy, were re-equipped with American weapons. They eventually joined the fight against the Axis forces in Tunisia. These were tough, experienced soldiers. The French Expeditionary Corps, forged from these North African units, would later go on to fight with distinction in the Italian campaign. The historian Julian Jackson, in his biography A Certain Idea of France, The Life of Charles de Gaulle, explains how de Gaulle used the base of power he eventually secured in Algiers to establish his legitimacy as the true leader of fighting France. North Africa became the de facto capital of the Free French movement before the liberation of Paris. The campaign forced the French to choose a side, and in doing so, it helped forge the army that would eventually march home. What do we still not know about this? How deep did the sympathies for the German cause really run within the Vichy officer corps in Africa? Was the Darlan deal truly a military necessity or a political blunder that could have been avoided? And if Darlan hadn't been assassinated, how would the leadership of the French resistance have evolved? Number 15. What did the leaders decide while the armies fought? The wars are not just fought by soldiers. They are directed by politicians. The North African campaign forced the leaders of the Allied powers, primarily American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to make some of the most critical decisions of the war. Their choices, made thousands of miles away, had a direct impact on the soldiers in the dust and heat. The campaign itself was a product of a huge strategic debate. By early 1942, the Americans, led by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, wanted to invade France as soon as possible. They believed in a direct, head-on assault on the main enemy. Churchill and his British commanders, however, were haunted by the memory of the First World War's trench warfare. They argued for a more indirect approach. They wanted to attack the soft underbelly of Axis-controlled Europe, starting with North Africa. They believed it was a less risky way to engage German forces, open the Mediterranean, and gain experience. Roosevelt was caught in the middle. He knew the American public and military wanted action, but he also saw the logic in the British position. The American army was not yet ready for a full-scale invasion of France. As described in The Day of Battle by Rick Atkinson, Roosevelt ultimately sided with Churchill. He made the political decision to greenlight Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, for late 1942. This decision was a compromise, but it set the entire strategic direction for the Allies for the next year and a half. Once the fighting was underway, the campaign continued to be a political hotbed. The Allied landings in November 1942 brought them into contact with the complicated world of Vichy French politics, leading to the controversial Darlan deal. This was a purely political solution to a military problem, and it strained the relationship between the Americans, the British, and the Free French under Charles de Gaulle. Perhaps the most famous political event linked to the campaign was the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. While the battle for Tunisia was still raging, Roosevelt and Churchill met in the Moroccan city. It was a high-stakes meeting. One of the biggest outcomes was the public declaration of the unconditional surrender policy. This meant the Allies would accept nothing less than the complete and total defeat of the Axis powers. There would be no negotiated peace, no armistice like the one that ended the First World War. This policy was designed to reassure their Soviet ally that they would not make a separate peace, and it was meant to send a clear, unyielding message to their enemies. The policy has been debated by historians ever since. Some, like the military historian B.H. Liddell Hart, later argued it may have prolonged the war by making the German leadership feel they had no choice but to fight to the bitter end. At Casablanca, the leaders also planned the next steps. With victory in North Africa looking likely, they agreed that the next target would be Sicily, followed by an invasion of mainland Italy. This confirmed the soft underbelly strategy, delaying the cross-channel invasion of France until 1944. This decision was a major point of contention with the Soviets, who were desperate for a major second front in France to draw German divisions away from the east. The decisions made in a Moroccan hotel room charted the course for the war in Europe for the next 18 months. The North African campaign was not just a battleground, it was the backdrop for the grand strategy of the entire Allied war effort. So, what mysteries remain? How close did Roosevelt come to siding with his own generals and demanding an invasion of France in 1943, and what would have happened if he had? Was the unconditional surrender policy a calculated strategic decision or a piece of public relations that backfired? And what private deals and promises were made between Roosevelt and Churchill at Casablanca that were never written down? Number 14, how did the desert change the way armies fought? The desert was a terrible place to fight. It was a vast open expanse with few landmarks, extreme temperatures, and almost no cover. You couldn't dig trenches in rocky ground. There were no forests to hide in, no cities to use as strong points. This unique environment forced armies to throw out the old rule books and invent new ways of fighting. In North Africa became a laboratory for modern warfare. The biggest star of this new warfare was the tank. In the wide open spaces of the desert, tanks came into their own. The fighting was more like naval warfare than traditional land combat. Formations of tanks would maneuver across the sand like fleets of battleships, trying to outflank and outgun each other. On battles like El Alamein involved hundreds of tanks on both sides. The British started with flimsy Crusader and Stuart tanks, which were no match for the better armored and better gunned German panzers. The historian James Holland, in his book The War in the West, emphasizes the steep learning curve. The British had to learn hard lessons about tank design and tactics. The arrival of the American-made M4 Sherman tank in large numbers before the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 was a game changer. It was reliable, had a good gun, and there were lots of them, but tanks couldn't win alone. The Desert War proved the vital importance of combined arms. This meant coordinating tanks, infantry, and artillery so they all worked together. An anti-tank gun was the tank's deadliest enemy. So tanks needed artillery to shell the anti-tank guns and infantry to go in and capture the crews. The German Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel was particularly good at this. They would use their powerful 88mm anti-aircraft guns in a flat anti-tank roll, luring British tanks into a deadly trap. The British and later the Americans had to learn how to counter these tactics. They learned to lead with artillery barrages and to screen their tanks with infantry. And air power was also crucial. With no place to hide, armies were incredibly vulnerable to attack from the sky. Whichever side controlled the air had a massive advantage. They could bomb and strafe enemy columns, supply depots, and airfields. The German Stuka dive bomber became a feared weapon early in the campaign, but the Allies, particularly the British Desert Air Force, gradually gained air superiority. They developed new techniques like cab ranks of fighter bombers that would circle over the battlefield, waiting for a call from troops on the ground to attack a specific target. This close air support was a forerunner of the tactics that would be used so effectively later in the war, like during the D-Day landings. Finally, the desert gave birth to new kinds of soldiers. The vast, unguarded flanks were perfect for small, elite units to cause chaos deep behind enemy lines. The British created the long-range desert group Lurdgi, masters of desert navigation, who would drive for hundreds of miles to gather intelligence. They also formed the Special Air Service SAS, led by David Stirling. The SAS would use Lurdgi jeeps to raid enemy airfields at night, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground. These special forces operations were a new kind of warfare, proving that a handful of daring men could have an impact far out of proportion to their numbers. The book Stirling's Men by Gavin Mortimer chronicles these early audacious raids that wrote the first chapter in the history of modern special operations. The desert stripped war down to its essentials: firepower, mobility, and coordination. The lessons learned there were paid for in blood, but they were invaluable for the later campaigns in Italy and France. What are the lingering questions? How much did the specific desert terrain, as opposed to simply new technology, drive the development of combined arms tactics? Were the early SAS raids strategically significant, or were they more of a morale-boosting nuisance to the enemy? And how would the tank battles have played out if both sides had access to equally capable machines from the start? Number 13, were codes more powerful than tanks? On the surface, the North African campaign was a war of tanks and guns, but behind the scenes, a secret war was being fought. It was a war of whispers, of radio signals, and of broken codes. And in this hidden conflict, the Allies had a weapon that their enemies never knew about. It was arguably the most important weapon of the entire campaign. The German military believed its communications were secure. They used a complex cipher machine called Enigma to encrypt their radio messages. They thought the codes it produced were unbreakable. They were wrong. At a secret location in Britain called Bletchley Park, a team of brilliant mathematicians and linguists, including the famous Alan Turing, had figured out how to read the Enigma messages. The intelligence gleaned from these decrypted messages was given the code name Ultra. Ultra intelligence gave the Allied commanders in North Africa an almost unbelievable advantage. They could often read the German and Italian messages before the intended recipients. They knew about their enemies' plans, their strength, their supply shortages, and their movements. For example, the commander of the British 8th Army, Bernard Montgomery, had a steady stream of ultra-intelligence in the lead-up to the crucial Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. As documented in F.W. Winterbotham's classic book, The Ultra Secret, Montgomery knew exactly which units Rommel had, where they were positioned, and, most importantly, how desperately short of fuel they were. This allowed him to plan his battle with a confidence that would have otherwise been impossible. He knew he could wear Rommel's army down in a battle of attrition because he knew Rommel couldn't maneuver or retreat effectively without fuel. Ultra was also devastatingly effective in the war at sea. The Axis war effort in Africa depended entirely on supplies shipped across the Mediterranean from Italy. The Ultra intercepts told the British Royal Navy and Air Force exactly when and where the supply convoys were sailing. British submarines and aircraft based on the besieged island of Malta could then be directed to attack them. The results were catastrophic for the Axis. In some months, over half of all the supplies sent to Rommel's army were sunk. Fuel tankers were a priority target. Time and again, Rommel would be on the verge of a breakthrough, only to have his tanks grind to a halt because a fuel convoy, which he had been told was on its way, was now at the bottom of the sea. Rommel himself wrote in his papers, later published as the Rommel Papers, about the mysterious and uncanny way the British seemed to know his every move, lamenting his bad luck. He never knew it wasn't luck. It was Bletchley Park. The Americans also had their own code-breaking successes. They had broken the black code used by German diplomats. This gave them valuable insight into the reports being sent back to Berlin from Washington and other capitals. During Operation Torch, American codebreakers helped provide intelligence on Vichy French naval positions and intentions. The historian Stephen Budiansky, in his book Battle of Wits, argues that the contribution of the codebreakers was a decisive factor in the Allied victory. It was a force multiplier. It didn't replace the need for brave soldiers and good generals, but it made their jobs infinitely easier and more effective. The intelligence war tilted the entire campaign in the Allies' favor long before the first shot of many battles was even fired. What do we still wonder about? How many battles were won or lost because a key ultra message was either not decrypted in time or was misinterpreted by commanders on the ground? Did the German high command ever seriously suspect that Enigma was compromised? And if so, why didn't they act on it more decisively? And could the Allies have won in North Africa without Ultra, or would it have been a bloody stalemate? Number 12 was the war won by bullets or beans. Generals get the glory. They study maps and plan brilliant maneuvers, but armies don't run on brilliant plans. They run on fuel, water, ammunition, and food. The study of how to get these things to the front line is called logistics. In the vast, empty desert of North Africa, logistics wasn't just part of the war, it was the war. The entire campaign was a relentless struggle against distance. The geography was punishing. The main theater of war was a narrow coastal strip. The only real ports were hundreds of miles apart, like Alexandria in Egypt, Benghazi and Tripoli in Libya, and Tunis in Tunisia. Whoever held the ports could bring in supplies, but from there, everything had to be trucked for immense distances along a single vulnerable coastal road. An army could advance only as far as its supply trucks could reach. This created a strange pendulum effect for much of the early war. The British would advance from Egypt, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. Then the Germans and Italians would counterattack, forcing the British back until their own supply lines became overstretched. The front line swung back and forth across Libya for 2 years. The German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, was a master of the fast, daring advance. But this aggression was also his greatest weakness. He consistently outran his supplies. His offensives would often run out of steam not because of British resistance, but because his tanks literally ran out of gas. This problem was made 1,000 times worse by the British control of the sea and air. As historian Martin van Creveld details in his seminal work, Supplying War, the Axis had to ship every drop of fuel, every bullet, and every bag of flour across the Mediterranean. With British forces on the island of Malta and a steady stream of ultra-intelligence pinpointing convoys, a huge percentage of Axis shipping was sunk. Rommel was in a constant state of logistical starvation. The British capture of a massive supply dump at Tobruk in 1942 was a temporary reprieve for him, but it was never enough. The Allies had their own logistical nightmares. The British Eighth Army, advancing from Egypt, had to haul its supplies over 1,300 miles from Alexandria to Tripoli. But they had one massive advantage: secure long-distance supply lines. While Axis supplies had to risk the dangerous Mediterranean crossing, Allied supplies could come the long way around Africa to the Suez Canal, or, after Operation Torch, be landed directly in Morocco and Algeria. The American entry into the war transformed the logistical landscape. The United States was an industrial powerhouse. It began to pour a torrent of equipment into North Africa: trucks, jeeps, tanks, and planes. The 2.5-ton GMC truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, became the workhorse of the Allied armies. Thousands of them, driven day and night, formed a non-stop conveyor belt of supplies to the front. After the Allies captured the key port of Tripoli in January 1943, they were able to properly supply their armies for the final push into Tunisia. In the end, the Axis forces were squeezed between two well-supplied Allied armies. They had fought brilliantly at times, but they were exhausted, short on everything, and had no way to be resupplied or reinforced. In May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. They had not been outfought as much as they had been outsupplied. The battle for North Africa was ultimately won not by a clever tactic on the battlefield, but by the relentless grinding work of the truck drivers, mechanics, and quartermasters. What are the unanswered questions? Just how much captured Allied equipment did Rommel's forces rely on? And could his 1942 offensive have happened without it? If the Axis had succeeded in capturing Malta, would that have tipped the logistical balance enough for them to win the campaign? And what was the true human cost for the truck drivers who had to brave air attacks and exhaustion to keep the armies moving? Number 11, how did one man become the desert fox? Sometimes a single personality can come to define a conflict. In North Africa, that personality was Erwin Rommel. To the British soldiers who fought against him, he was a near mythical figure. To the German propaganda machine, he was the brilliant, daring commander who could win against all odds. To history, he is the Desert Fox, one of the most famous generals of the Second World War. But how did this legend come to be? When Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941, the Italian army had just suffered a series of disastrous defeats at the hands of a much smaller British force. His mission was to command a small German contingent, the Deutsches Afrikakorps, and simply stabilize the front. His orders were to remain on the defensive. Rommel ignored them. He was a man of incredible energy, ambition, and a supreme belief in himself. He favored speed, surprise, and leading from the very front of the battle, often in a command vehicle or a small spotter plane. This was highly unusual for a general, and it gave him an incredible feel for the flow of a battle. Within weeks of arriving, he launched a surprise attack that stunned the British. He pushed them all the way back to the Egyptian border, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of territory. Only the fortified port of Tobruk held out behind his lines. This audacious offensive established his reputation overnight. The British press, and even Winston Churchill himself, began to speak of him with a mixture of fear and admiration. Calling him the Desert Fox was a sign of respect for a clever and dangerous adversary. This actually served a purpose for the British leadership. By building up Rommel as a military genius, their own defeats at his hands seemed less embarrassing. Rommel's style of warfare was perfectly suited to the desert. He was a master of mobile, combined arms tactics. He understood how to use tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery together to devastating effect. His signature move was to lure British tanks forward into a screen of well-hidden 88mm anti-tank guns, which could destroy them from long range. He was also a master of deception. He would have Volkswagen cars kick up dust to simulate an armored column, or build fake tanks out of wood to fool Allied reconnaissance planes. As described in the biography Knight's Cross by David Fraser, his leadership was based on personal charisma and a relentless drive. However, the legend also hides some important truths. Rommel was a brilliant tactical commander, but he was a reckless strategist. He repeatedly pushed his forces forward without any thought for his supply lines, leading to the pendulum war that swung back and forth across the desert. His obsession with capturing Tobruk in 1941 and 1942 led to costly failures, and while he was a master of the fast-moving battle, he was less skilled in the slow, grinding fight of attrition. When he came up against Bernard Montgomery at El Alamein, a methodical general who had overwhelming superiority in men and material, Rommel's tactical tricks were not enough. He was also a product of the German military system, which produced highly professional and effective soldiers. The Afrika Korps was an elite force, and its success was not just down to one man. The legend of the Desert Fox was partly his own creation, partly a creation of German propaganda, and partly a creation of his enemies. He was a superb general, but he was not invincible. His defeat was as important to the campaign's story as his victories. What key questions remain? How much of Rommel's success was due to his own genius versus the initial incompetence of his British opponents? To what extent was Rommel's reputation in the Allied world deliberately inflated by Allied leaders for their own political purposes? And did his fame and his style of command ultimately do more harm than good to the Axis war effort in Africa by encouraging reckless, unsustainable offensives? Number 10, where were the great generals forged? A battlefield is a crucible. It tests soldiers, but it tests commanders even more. The immense pressures of command can break a person, or they can forge them into something extraordinary. North Africa was a brutal training ground, but it was also the place where some of the most important Allied commanders of the war learned their trade and made their names. For the British, the key figure was Bernard Montgomery. When he took command of the 8th Army in August 1942, morale was at rock bottom. The army had been repeatedly defeated and pushed back into Egypt. Montgomery, or Monty, was an unusual character. He was prickly, arrogant, and difficult to work with, but he was exactly what the 8th Army needed. He was a master of preparation and organization. He famously declared, "No more retreat." He visited the troops, projecting an aura of absolute confidence. He understood that before his army could win a battle, it had to believe it could win. His book, The Memoirs of Field Marshal Montgomery, reveals his meticulous approach to planning. He refused to attack until he had overwhelming superiority in tanks, guns and supplies. His great victory at the Second Battle of Alain, his great victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 was not a battle of brilliant maneuver, but a brutal grinding fight that he had carefully planned to win through. Monty's methods were slow and cautious, but they were effective. El Alamein was the first major land victory for the Allies against the German army, and it made Montgomery a national hero. For the Americans, North Africa was their first real test of the war, and it was a painful one. The U.S. Army was green and inexperienced. This was starkly revealed at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943. American forces were outmaneuvered and routed by a smaller German force. It was a humiliating defeat. The commander of the U.S. II Corps, Lloyd Fredendall, was sacked. The overall Allied commander for the invasion, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had to learn a harsh lesson about picking the right commanders. In his book, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower reflected on this difficult period. Kasserine Pass was a disaster, but it was also a wake-up call. Out of that disaster came another legendary commander, George S. Patton. Eisenhower put Patton in command of the Battered Corps. Patton was the polar opposite of Montgomery. He was flamboyant, aggressive, and swore constantly. He was a firm believer in discipline. He immediately ordered the American troops to wear their helmets and leggings at all times, and he imposed a strict training regimen. He restored the American soldiers' shattered pride and self-respect. He then led them in a series of successful hard-driving attacks. Patton proved that American soldiers could fight, and fight well if they were properly led. The campaign was also the making of Eisenhower. He started as a staff officer who had never commanded troops in combat. In North Africa, He had to manage the clashing personalities of men like Montgomery and Patton and navigate the treacherous waters of inter-allied politics. He proved to be a master diplomat and coalition leader. The skills he honed in North Africa were the very skills he would need 2 years later as the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Normandy. The desert was a harsh school, but its graduates would go on to lead the liberation of Europe. What are the enduring mysteries? Was Montgomery's caution after El Alamein a prudent move to preserve his forces, or did it allow the remnants of Rommel's army to escape when they could have been destroyed? How much of Patton's success was due to his leadership, and how much was due to the fact that he took command after the German forces were already overstretched and weakened? And what if Eisenhower had failed to manage the coalition in North Africa? Who else could have held the alliance together? Number 9, what if the German armies in Russia and Africa had met? History is full of what-if moments. In 1942, the Axis powers had a grand, ambitious, strategic vision. It was a pincer movement on a truly global scale. One arm of the pincer was the German Army Group advancing deep into the Soviet Union, driving towards the Caucasus and its rich oil fields. The other arm was Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa, pushing east towards the Suez Canal. The plan was for these two forces to meet somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps in Persia, modern-day Iran. If this had happened, the consequences for the Allies would have been catastrophic. It would have been a strategic blow from which they might never have recovered. First, it would have meant the collapse of the British position in the entire Middle East. Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Iraq would have fallen. This would have given the German war machine access to the vast oil reserves of the region. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare. With Middle Eastern oil, the German tanks, planes, and submarines could have fought on for years, even without the oil from the Caucasus. The Allied naval blockade would have been rendered far less effective. Second, a link-up would have cut the main Allied supply route to the Soviet Union. The Persian corridor was a vital channel through which the Western Allies sent thousands of trucks, tanks, and other supplies to the Soviets to help them in their desperate struggle on the Eastern Front. Without these supplies, the ability of the Soviet army to resist could have been severely compromised. Third, it would have posed a direct threat to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. With the Germans in the Middle East and their Japanese allies advancing through Burma towards India's eastern border, the subcontinent would have been caught in a giant pincer. The political and military pressure on India could have been immense, potentially forcing Britain to divert huge resources to its defense, or even leading to India's collapse. The historian Andrew Roberts, in his book The Storm of War, discusses the sheer scale of this German ambition. The two battles that stopped this grand strategy from becoming a reality were fought in the autumn of 1942, thousands of miles apart. In North Africa, Montgomery's 8th Army stopped Rommel's final advance at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November. In the Soviet Union, the German 6th Army was stopped and then encircled at the Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943. These two battles, fought in completely different environments, were inextricably linked. They were the high watermarks of Axis expansion. After El Alamein and Stalingrad, the German armies were on the defensive on both fronts. The great pincer was broken. The fight in the North African desert was not just for control of a few ports on the Mediterranean, it was a fight to prevent a strategic disaster of global proportions. It secured the Middle East, protected the Allied supply line to Russia, and slammed the door on Germany's eastern ambitions. So, what are the big unknowns? How seriously did the German high command actually pursue this link-up strategy, or was it more of a vague ambition than a concrete operational plan? What level of coordination, if any, existed between the German commanders in Russia and those in Africa? And if Rommel had broken through at El Alamein, did he actually have the logistical capacity to drive all the way to Persia, or would his army have simply collapsed in the desert east of Suez? Number 8, how much did a desert victory matter back home? War is not just fought on the battlefield, it is also fought in the hearts and minds of the people back home. For the first 3 years of the war, the news for the British public had been almost relentlessly bad. There had been defeats in France, Norway, and Greece. In Asia, Singapore had fallen. German submarines were sinking ships in the Atlantic. There was a desperate need for some good news, a sign that the war could be won. The North African campaign provided that glimmer of hope. The victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942 was more than just a military success. It was a massive psychological turning point. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill heard the news, he was ecstatic. He famously said, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." For the first time in the war, the church bells were rung across Britain to celebrate a victory. For a public weary of rationing, blackouts, and bad news, El Alamein was a tonic. It was a clear, unambiguous victory against the German army, won by British and Commonwealth forces. It proved that the Germans were not invincible. The newspapers were filled with stories of the desert rats of the Eighth Army and their commander, Monty. And Montgomery became a household name and a national hero. His familiar black beret became an icon of victory. The campaign provided a sense of pride and a much-needed boost to morale on the home front. This was crucial for maintaining public support for the long and costly war effort. The victory helped to galvanize the British people for the struggles that still lay ahead. For the United States, the campaign had a different but equally important psychological impact. For most Americans, the war in Europe was distant and abstract. The main focus of public anger was on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa in November 1942, was the first major American offensive in the European theater. It brought the war home in a new way. Newspapers published maps of Morocco and Algeria. Families listened anxiously to radio reports from correspondents like Edward R. Murrow. The initial news was confusing. There was the shock of fighting the Vichy French, and then the humiliation of the defeat at Kasserine Pass. But then came the stories of Patton's successes and the final victory in Tunisia. The sight of nearly 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendering to Allied forces in May 1943 was a powerful message. It was proof that the American industrial might and manpower could be translated into victory on the battlefield. As David M. Kennedy explains in his book Freedom from Fear, the North African campaign helped to convince the American public that the Germany First strategy was correct, and that the war in Europe, as well as the Pacific, could be won. It blooded the American army and, just as importantly, it blooded the American public, preparing them for the greater sacrifices that would be required for the invasions of Italy and France. And for both Britain and America, the Desert Victory was a symbol that the tide of the war was finally turning. What do we still not know? How was the news of the victory actually received by ordinary families beyond the official newspaper reports? Did the heavy casualties in the campaign create any significant anti-war sentiment back home that has been overlooked by historians? And how did the American public react to the initial defeats like Kasserine Pass? Was there a crisis of confidence in the military's ability to wage the war? Number 7, did the fight in Africa break Italy's will? For Italy and its leader Benito Mussolini, the war was meant to be an opportunity to build a new Roman Empire. North Africa was supposed to be the jewel in that empire's crown. Libya had been an Italian colony for decades. The plan was to invade and conquer Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. It did not work out that way. The North African campaign became a disaster that bled the Italian military dry and shattered the country's will to fight. The war started poorly for Italy. In late 1940, a massive Italian army invaded Egypt from Libya. It was met by a much smaller British and Commonwealth force, which not only stopped the invasion but launched a stunning counterattack called Operation Compass. In a matter of weeks, the British routed the Italian 10th Army, advancing hundreds of miles and taking over 130,000 prisoners. The Italian army in Africa was on the verge of complete collapse. This was a national humiliation. It was only the arrival of the German Afrika Korps under Rommel in early 1941 that saved the Axis position in Libya. From that point on, the Italian army played a secondary role to its German allies. While many Italian divisions fought with great bravery, they were consistently let down by their equipment and their leadership. Their tanks were obsolete, their artillery was outdated, and their training was poor compared to the Germans. They were often treated with contempt by their German allies, who took the best equipment and supplies for themselves. The Italian soldiers fought a difficult war, suffering from the same shortages of water, food and fuel as the Germans, but with inferior tools. The losses were staggering. In the Second Battle of El Alamein, entire Italian divisions, like the Ariete Armored Division, were annihilated after fighting courageously. But the final blow was the collapse in Tunisia. In May 1943, when the Axis forces surrendered, the majority of the 250,000 prisoners were Italian. Italy had lost its best trained and most experienced soldiers. It had lost its entire African empire. The effect back home in Italy was devastating. The war had never been universally popular, and the constant stream of bad news from Africa destroyed what little public enthusiasm there was. The loss of so many sons, brothers, and husbands for no apparent gain turned the population against the government and the war. As the historian R.J.B. Bosworth writes in his book Mussolini's Italy, the defeat in Africa was the final nail in the coffin for the fascist regime's credibility. It exposed the military weakness of the state and the hollowness of its imperial ambitions. The defeat was a direct catalyst for the events of the summer of 1943. Just 2 months after the surrender in Tunisia, the Allies invaded Sicily. The invasion met with weak resistance. The Italian government, seeing, the writing on the wall, turned on its leader. Mussolini was overthrown and arrested in July 1943. Soon after, Italy surrendered to the Allies. The road to the collapse of the Italian war effort began in the sands of the North African desert. What are the lingering historical questions? How much of the Italian army's poor performance was due to bad equipment versus a genuine lack of fighting spirit among the troops? To what extent did tensions between German and Italian commanders on the ground contribute to the Axis defeat? And if Italy had possessed a more modern army and navy in 1940, could they have won the North African campaign before the Germans even had to get involved? Number 6 was North Africa, just a stepping stone to Europe. The North African campaign was a massive undertaking in its own right, but for Allied grand strategists, it was never an end in itself. It was always a means to an end. From the very beginning, the plan was to use North Africa as a springboard for an attack on what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. Once the Allies had cleared all of North Africa of Axis forces by May 1943, they were in a dominant strategic position. They had air bases in Tunisia and Algeria that were only a short flight from the Italian islands of Sicily and Sardinia. They had major ports like Tunis, Algiers, and Oran from which they could launch a massive amphibious invasion. The Mediterranean, which had been a dangerous contested sea for 3 years, was now firmly under Allied control. This opened sea lanes for Allied shipping, drastically shortening the supply route to the Middle East and India. The long voyage around Africa was no longer necessary, which freed up huge amounts of shipping for use elsewhere. The decision on what to do next was made at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The Americans, particularly General Marshall, were still keen on a cross-channel invasion of France as soon as possible. But the British argued persuasively that the Allies were not yet strong enough for such a risky operation. They pointed out that the troops' planes and landing craft already assembled in North Africa were perfectly positioned for an attack on Italy. An invasion of Italy, they argued, could knock the weakest of the major Axis powers out of the war, force Germany to divert divisions to a new front, and provide air bases even closer to the German heartland. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. The next target would be Sicily. The invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was launched in July 1943. It was a massive operation, even larger in its initial landings than the D-Day invasion of Normandy would be a year later. The troops who took part were the same veteran divisions, both American and British, that had fought their way across North Africa. They had learned hard lessons in the desert about combined arms, amphibious landings, and inter-allied cooperation. North Africa was their training ground. Sicily was their final exam. The campaign in Sicily was a success. It led directly to the downfall of Mussolini and the surrender of Italy. The Allies then invaded mainland Italy in September 1943. This opened up a new grinding front that would tie down dozens of German divisions for the rest of the war. These were divisions that could not be used to fight the Soviets on the Eastern Front or to defend the coast of France from the expected Allied invasion. The Italian campaign was long, bloody, and controversial, but it would have been impossible without first securing North Africa. The Desert Campaign was the essential first step on the long road that led the Allied armies from the beaches of Morocco to the heart of Europe. What are the big what ifs for historians? Was the soft underbelly strategy a brilliant move or a costly diversion that delayed the decisive invasion of France? If the Allies had decided to invade Sardinia and Corsica instead of Sicily, how would the war in the Mediterranean have played out differently? And how much of the experience gained in the relatively small-scale landings of Operation Torch contribute to the success of the much larger amphibious assaults in Sicily and later at Normandy? Number 5, could the Americans and British ever truly work together? Well, modern wars are fought by coalitions, but getting armies from different countries with different traditions, different equipment, and different ways of doing things to work together is incredibly difficult. The North African campaign was the first time that American and British forces had to fight side by side on a large scale. It was a messy, often difficult, but ultimately successful experiment in coalition warfare. The relationship started with a degree of suspicion on both sides. The British had been fighting for 3 years. They saw themselves as the seasoned veterans. They sometimes looked down on the Americans as talented amateurs who didn't yet understand the realities of war. The Americans, on the other hand, arrived full of confidence and energy. They sometimes saw the British as old-fashioned, overly cautious, and stuck in the past. These cultural clashes were reflected in the personalities of their commanders. The flamboyant, aggressive American General George Patton had very little in common with the cautious, methodical British General Bernard Montgomery. Their rivalry became legendary. The first major test of the alliance was Operation Torch. The invasion was commanded by an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower. This was a political necessity, as the invading forces were landing in French territory, and it was thought the Vichy French would be less likely to resist an American commander than a British one. From the start, Eisenhower's headquarters was a combined staff of American and British officers. There were constant disagreements over strategy, tactics, and logistics. As Rick Atkinson's book An Army at Dawn is filled with accounts of the friction and arguments that characterized the early days of the alliance. The battlefield exposed the different levels of experience. At Kasserine Pass, the new American troops were badly defeated. Some British commanders were quick to criticize, confirming their prejudices about American inexperience. This created resentment among the Americans, but the defeat also forced the alliance to work better. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, had to act as a diplomat, smoothing over ruffled feathers and forcing his subordinates to cooperate. He learned to identify the most effective commanders, regardless of their nationality. Slowly, through shared struggle, the two armies developed a grudging respect for each other. The Americans learned from the British experience in desert warfare. The British came to admire the incredible amount of high-quality equipment and logistical power that the Americans brought to the fight. By the final stages of the campaign in Tunisia, the Allied forces were operating as a much more cohesive unit. The American Two Corps held one part of the front, while the British 1st and 8th Armies held others. Their attacks were coordinated under a single, unified command structure led by the British General Harold Alexander, with Eisenhower as the overall theater commander. The final victory in Tunisia, with the capture of 250,000 enemy soldiers, was a true coalition victory. It proved that the alliance could work. The personal relationships and command structures forged in the heat of North Africa were the foundation upon which the successful D-Day invasion and the campaign in Northwest Europe would be built. It was a difficult marriage, but it was one that had to succeed. What do we still need to understand? How much did the personal rivalries between senior generals like Patton and Montgomery actually hinder military operations on the ground? Were there instances of American or British units refusing to cooperate with each other during a battle? And how did the ordinary soldiers of both armies view each other, away from the watchful eyes of their officers? Number 4, how did the Green Army learn to fight in the sand? When the United States entered the war, it had a very small peacetime army. It faced the enormous challenge of rapidly training millions of new soldiers and sending them into combat against one of the most professional and battle-hardened armies in the world. North Africa was the American Army's first classroom. The lessons were brutal. The American landings in Operation Torch in November 1942 were met with surprisingly stiff resistance from Vichy French forces. This was the first shock. The American troops were green, a military term for inexperienced. They had been trained in the United States, but nothing could fully prepare them for the reality of combat. They were well equipped, but their leadership and tactics were untested. The ultimate test came in February 1943 in central Tunisia. It was a series of battles that culminated at a place called Kasserine Pass. Here, the inexperienced American forces of the I Corps were attacked by veteran German and Italian armored units. The result was a disaster. American units were poorly positioned, communications broke down, command was confused. Some units fought bravely, but others broke and ran in the face of the enemy onslaught. The Germans pushed through the pass, inflicting thousands of casualties and capturing huge amounts of equipment. It was one of the worst defeats for the U.S. Army in its entire history. The shock of Kasserine Pass was felt all the way up to the top of the Allied command. General Eisenhower, the overall commander, was shaken. He realized that the problems were systemic. The commander of the E Corps, General Lloyd Fredendall, who had tried to command the battle from a heavily fortified bunker 70 miles behind the front, was relieved of command. As Eisenhower replaced him with General George S. Patton, Patton's arrival marked a turning point. He was a ruthless and demanding commander who immediately set about restoring discipline and morale. But the changes went deeper than just one man. The entire American army in North Africa went back to school. They had learned hard, bloody lessons about the reality of war. They learned that their tanks' guns were often too weak. They learned that their anti-tank tactics were ineffective. They learned the crucial importance of coordinating infantry, artillery, and air power. They learned that good training and aggressive, competent leadership were the difference between life and death. In the months after Kasserine, the U.S. Army in Tunisia was transformed. Under Patton, and later under General Omar Bradley, the I Corps went on the offensive. As they fought a series of tough, successful battles, culminating in the capture of the key city of Bizerte. By the time the campaign ended in May 1943, the American army was no longer green. It was a seasoned, effective fighting force. The defeat at Kasserine Pass was humiliating, but it was perhaps the most important thing that could have happened. It forced the U.S. Army to confront its weaknesses and fix them. The army that went on to invade Sicily and Italy, and later to land on the beaches of Normandy, was an army that had earned its diploma in the harsh classroom of the Tunisian hills. What are the questions that remain? How close did the U.S. Army come to a complete collapse of morale after Kasserine Pass? Were the equipment problems, such as the quality of American tanks, a more significant factor in the defeat than the failures of leadership? And did the lessons learned in North Africa lead to an overcorrection, making the U.S. Army too cautious in its later campaigns? Number 3, did the desert really help the Eastern Front? For much of the war, the Soviet Union fought alone against the bulk of the German army. From 1941 onwards, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin repeatedly and desperately demanded that his Western allies, Britain and America, open a second front in Europe. He wanted them to launch a major invasion of France to draw German divisions away from the east and relieve the immense pressure on the Red Army. The American military leadership generally agreed with Stalin. They wanted to attack Germany as directly and as quickly as possible. But the British, led by Winston Churchill, were far more cautious. They remembered the horrific casualties of the First World War and feared that a premature invasion of France would be a bloodbath. The British Army was not yet strong enough, and the American Army was not yet experienced enough. Instead, Churchill proposed the North African campaign. This decision was a major source of tension between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Stalin was deeply suspicious. He saw the North African campaign as a diversion, a British attempt to protect their own imperial interests in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, while leaving the Soviets to do the bulk of the fighting and dying. He dismissed it as an unimportant sideshow, but was he right? While the North African campaign was not the massive second front in France that Stalin wanted, it was far from being a sideshow. It had a direct and significant impact on the war on the Eastern Front. First, it forced Germany to divert precious resources to a new theater of war. The German Afrika Korps was an elite force, equipped with some of Germany's best tanks and led by one of its best generals. In addition to the ground troops, Germany had to commit a significant portion of its air force, the Luftwaffe, to the Mediterranean. Every plane, every tank, every soldier, and every barrel of fuel sent to North Africa was one that could not be used against the Soviet Union. The campaign escalated over time. After the Allied landings in Operation Torch, the Germans rushed reinforcements to Tunisia. At its peak, the Axis had several 100,000 troops in North Africa. These were veteran soldiers and elite panzer divisions that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where the titanic struggle for Stalingrad was reaching its climax. The final surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia in May 1943 was a disaster for the German war machine, a Tunistrad that echoed the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Furthermore, the Allied victory in North Africa led directly to the invasion of Italy. This opened up a true second front in southern Europe that would tie down dozens of German divisions for the rest of the war. These were divisions that could have been used to try to halt the relentless advance of the Red Army. So, while the campaign in the desert was not what Stalin had in mind, it was a vital contribution to the overall Allied war effort. It was a war of attrition on a global scale. By forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts, the Western Allies bled its resources and paved the way for its eventual collapse. The soldiers fighting in the dust of Tunisia were directly helping the soldiers fighting in the snows of Russia. What do historians still debate? How many German divisions were ultimately diverted from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean theater as a direct result of the North African campaign and the subsequent invasion of Italy? If the Allies had attempted an invasion of France in 1943 instead, would it have failed? And what would that have meant for the Soviet Union? And to what extent did Stalin's anger over the delay in opening a second front in France shape his post-war policies towards the West? Number 2, could the war have been won without ruling the waves? The Mediterranean Sea is a crossroads. It connects Europe, Africa, and Asia. For centuries, empires have fought for control of its waters. During the Second World War, this ancient sea once again became a critical battlefield. The entire North African land campaign was utterly dependent on what happened at sea. Neither side could sustain its army without controlling the sea lanes that brought them supplies, reinforcements, and fuel. For the Axis powers, the supply line was short, but incredibly dangerous. It was a 300-mile journey from ports in Italy and Sicily to Tripoli or Benghazi in Libya. This route was the lifeline of Rommel's Afrika Korps, but the British Royal Navy was determined to cut it. The British had major naval bases at Gibraltar at the western end of the Mediterranean and at Alexandria, Egypt in the east. But their most important weapon was a tiny rocky island located right in the middle of the Axis supply route, Malta. Malta was, as one leader called it, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. From its airfields, British planes could attack Axis supply convoys. From its harbor, British submarines and warships could sortie to sink enemy ships. The island was under constant heavy air attack for years. The siege of Malta was one of the epic struggles of the war. The island's survival was absolutely crucial to the Allied war effort. When Malta was strong, Rommel's army starved. When Malta was weakened by bombing, Rommel's supplies got through, and he could launch an offensive. The fate of the Desert War was directly tied to the fate of this small island. The Allies also depended on the sea. The British Eighth Army in Egypt was supplied through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, a route protected by the Royal Navy. But the game changed with Operation Torch. The massive invasion fleet that brought the American army to North Africa had to cross the Atlantic, facing the threat of German U-boats, and then enter the Mediterranean. It was a huge logistical feat. Securing the ports of Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers was the primary objective of the landings. Once the Allies had a foothold in North Africa, their control of the sea gave them a decisive advantage. They could land troops and supplies at multiple points, forcing the Axis to defend a long coastline. They could use their naval guns to support troops fighting near the coast. And most importantly, they could build up an overwhelming logistical superiority for the final battle in Tunisia. While the Axis forces were being strangled by the Allied blockade, the Allies were able to pour men and material ashore. The sea was their highway. The historian Corelli Barnett, in his book Engage the Enemy More Closely, argues that the war in the Mediterranean was fundamentally a naval war, where the land battles were just an extension of the fight for sea control. The final surrender in Tunisia was not just a defeat of the Axis armies. It was the culmination of a long and brutal naval campaign that had successfully cut them off and bled them white. Control of the Mediterranean was the grand prize that made everything else possible. What are the lingering questions? If the Axis had committed more resources and launched a full-scale amphibious invasion of Malta in 1942, would they have succeeded, and how would that have changed the course of the war? How effective was the Italian Navy during the campaign, and is its reputation for poor performance justified? And what was the real extent of German U-boat operations inside the Mediterranean, and how close did they come to cutting Allied supply lines during Operation Torch? Number one, why was a single canal worth so much blood? It's just a strip of water, about 120 miles long, cutting through the Egyptian desert. But the Suez Canal was one of the most important pieces of strategic real estate on the planet. And for the British Empire, it was the jugular vein. And in the Second World War, the fight for North Africa was, at its heart, a fight for the Suez Canal. The canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, was a vital shortcut. For Britain, it was the main artery connecting it to the eastern parts of its empire, to India, Australia, and New Zealand. More importantly, it was the gateway to the oil fields of the Middle East, particularly in Persia and Iraq. In a mechanized war, oil was everything. It fueled the ships, tanks, and planes. If the Axis powers could capture the Suez Canal, they would sever this jugular vein. They would cut Britain off from its empire and its oil. The strategic consequences would have been immense. And British shipping would have been forced to take the long, slow route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. This would have dramatically increased shipping times and strained the already overstretched Allied merchant marine. It would have made it incredibly difficult to supply British forces in the Middle East and India. It would have been a crippling blow. For the Axis, capturing the canal was a key objective. The Italian invasion of Egypt in 1940 was the first attempt to seize it. When that failed, the Germans sent Rommel and the Afrika Korps to finish the job. Rommel's great offensive in the summer of 1942 brought his army to within 60 miles of Alexandria in the Nile Delta. This was the moment of greatest peril for the Allies. If he had broken through at El Alamein, the canal and all of Egypt would have been his. The defense of the canal was therefore the absolute top priority for the British in the Middle East. They poured resources into the theater. The Eighth Army was a multinational force with troops from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India all fighting side by side. Their desperate stand at El Alamein in the autumn of 1942 was not just about defending a line in the sand, it was about defending the entire British strategic position in the east. The victory at El Alamein, followed by the Operation Torch landings, secured the canal for good. The Axis threat was pushed back and eventually eliminated. Once North Africa was in Allied hands, the Suez Canal became a secure highway for Allied shipping. It played a vital role in supplying the Soviet Union through the Persian corridor. It allowed the Allies to build up their forces for the eventual campaigns in Asia against Japan. The book, The Path to Victory by Douglas Porch, emphasizes that the entire Mediterranean strategy was built around the pivot point of the Suez Canal. The fight for the desert was long and costly. Thousands of men died in the battles for obscure places like Tobruk, Sidi Rezeh, and Kasserine Pass. But they were all, in a way, fighting for control of that one narrow strip of water. The Suez Canal was the prize, and its control was essential for the final Allied victory. What are the big questions that remain? How detailed were the Axis plans for what they would do after capturing the canal? Did they have a realistic strategy for holding and exploiting the Middle East? If Rommel had taken the canal, would the local population in Egypt have supported the Axis powers? And how much did the fear of losing the canal influence Churchill's strategic decisions, perhaps leading him to overinvest in the Mediterranean theater at the expense of other fronts?